This year, Margaret Gibson comes to us as a memoirist as well as a poet. And the reviews of her latest book, The Prodigal Daughter, Reclaiming an Unfinished Childhood, suggest a subtly different writer at work. Rather than expansive and freewheeling, the book is rooted in the cultural identity of Greater Richmond in the 1950s, offering, as one reviewer puts it, as readable an evocation of a time and place as I've ever come across. Another critic hails Gibson's prose as impeccable. Her portrayal of characters precise, giving the reader a glimpse of historical change through the eyes of a sensitive and insightful girl. Instead of large questions of human identity and the divine, this memoir traffics in matters of race, class, and institutionalized religion as a means of keeping people divided. While a personal account of Gibson's own childhood and maturation, it is also a cultural analysis of the highest order, where the author's eventual rejection of many tenets of her upbringing comprises an historical record for larger changes occurring around her, and even a call to arms for continued acts of self-discovery and transgression. At the same time, however, it is a memoir about reconciliation, about familial love that sometimes defies logic and certainly transcends time. Both poetry and memoir can be intensely personal, of course. Both use an author's history to speak to broader matters of human experience. But where poems are often elliptical, sometimes even intentionally obtuse, prose is more frequently direct and discursive. There's a common metaphor in writing circles that prose is a line where poetry is a circle. It's not uncommon to find people who write both, but it is rare to come across a writer who handles each as fluidly as Margaret Gibson. Moreover, who is not afraid to blend the two, employing language both lush and lyrical in her prose, or personal commentary raised to the political in her poetry. As to subject matter, perhaps the connections in her work have always been intuitive. In her poem, East Window, Moon, the speaker confirms that I have always been alone, I have never been alone. A sentiment that speaks to connections broadly human and cosmic, even as they seem familial and everyday. That poem closes with the beautiful sentiment, what I used to call the self is a windowing of light in the floodplain of the boundless. Herein lies the genius of Gibson's work, whether in prose or verse, her unerring ability to make the universal intimate, her comfort finding within the personal the profound. Along with her other recognitions, Margaret Gibson has been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts grant, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fellowship, 2 Pushcart Prizes, and the James Boatwright Poetry Prize. The author of 9 books of poetry in addition to her memoir, she is Professor Emerita of English at the University of Connecticut and presently lives in Preston, Connecticut. It is our pleasure to have her with us tonight. Please help me welcome Margaret Gibson.
Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me in the back and on the sides and under the seats? Well, where to begin? I think we could just leave after that introduction. It's not here. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm going to begin by reading a section from The Prodigal Daughter, a short section that has to do with my going to piano lessons on Clark Road. I lived on Lexington Road in West End. And I got to Clark Road by just slipping out the backyard gate and going over. I'm going to read this section because, in a sense, I think music is what language would like to be, if it could. And I have been a stubbornly lyric poet for most of my years of writing, no matter how much the lyric might sometimes get mixed up with narrative. So in some ways you can, I think of this passage as having something to do with why I became a writer. although that is not really the focus of the memoir, but for tonight it's the place to begin. One afternoon when the backyard seemed to float on its own scent, lilac and peony and plum, I paused at the backyard gate, unwilling to leave the yard, even though I wanted to play for Mrs. Bishop the complicated little piece I had practiced all week. Pausing at the gate was a ritual. Making that pause, I cleared my mind so that all the way to my piano lesson I thought of nothing at all. Then the music I'd learned filled me completely, like water poured to the lip of a drinking glass about to overflow. After 3 years of lessons, there was so much more to flow over that rim. Today, a sonata, but once, I remembered, I simply wanted to show Mrs. Bishop that my left hand could strike its few notes and move down the keyboard into deeper tones, and at the same time, my right hand could go confidently up keys into higher and higher notes. When the different notes fit together, though some were high and some were low, Mrs. Bishop said there was harmony. In the little song, my left hand was to stay near middle C and my right to travel further into the treble, going away and returning until finally both hands came back to middle C, which was home. The backyard gate was still my middle C. Standing there waiting to hear the click of the latch that sent me on my way, I could see myself unfolding like a row of paper cutout figures, making a linked path from the piano at home to the piano at Mrs. Bishop's. It was as if going to Mrs. Bishop's I never left home. As if going off for lessons on my own, I held hands with myself each step of the way. The Margaret who paused at the backyard gate, waiting in the drifts of fragrance, was linked to the Margaret scuffing her sneakers on our neighbor's gravel driveway to see the little stones leap, and she to the Margaret tagging up on the honeysuckle bush in a solitary game of tag, and she with the Margaret who withdrew the little thread from the honeysuckle bloom to release the drop of sweetness on her tongue, and she with the Margaret who paused at the sour-smelling boxwood at Mrs. Bishop's, then to become the leap in 3 strides over the mossy bricks, up the steps, the doorbell ringing its 3-noted, "Come right in." All these Margarets sat down together on the piano bench to release the music of a week's practice, to try her skill. When Mrs. Bishop played the piano, the skin on my arm shivered, and I became excited and quiet at the same time. When she played the piano, a great listening opened and took me into it. There was no gate to this listening, to this music, only entrance and intimacy and space. Listening to Mrs. Bishop play was a listening so complete I neither felt big nor little, good nor bad, skilled nor unskilled. I was not Margaret, not even my mother's Margaret. The cutout row of paper Margarets dropped their hands and fluttered off in the wind like the scraps of paper they were. Not that I disappeared. There I was, on the hard chair in Mrs. Bishop's living room, all of it part of the great listening. To listen like that was like being propped in the rough, barked Y branch of the backyard plum tree, the entire tree thick with tiny clusters of purple flowers that nestled along the branches. With the branches above me mysteriously distinct against the vivid blue of the sky, wind stirring the petals, I was swept into plum shade and sunlight, buried in blossoms. In so wide a solitude between earth and sky, I had no way of telling how long I was there. My back fit the branch of the plum tree, flower fit branch, sky fit earth. The wind soared, everything fit. The light was slanted along the grass when I climbed down. I heard my mother calling and calling me in for supper, calling my name, the word rising on the last syllable as if it were a question, a chord that needed to be resolved by my return. I turned and looked at the plum tree. The backyard gate had been left open. Returned home from the piano lessons, I was supposed to close it, but no, just now I wouldn't. I was very still inside, and I liked that stillness. Let everything stay as it is, I thought, just as it is. I turned and walked quietly over the cool grass, along the brick walk, and around the hackberry tree toward the kitchen. That passage for me has a lot to do with my poetry, the love of listening and stillness and clarity, being buried in blossoms and in the tree, all the rest of it. But more than that, it has a sense for me of that child's idyllic sense of harmony, everything fitting, and that's what the music lessons were all about. Had, however, of course, the things changed, and had I become committed to that notion of not changing, I would have missed quite a lot. I want to read that. This memoir is not really about how or why or what kind of writer I became or thinker or whatever. I want to read you a part of the opening chapter, Southbound. It is prose, but it's prose adapted from a poem that I had previously written. It has to do with the moment or the time in the year 2000 rather, when I came back here to help my sister, my younger sister, with whom I had never gotten along. We had always been described as extremely different. We had been either in conflict or indifferent to each other most of our childhoods and our adult life. And I came back to try to help. She was severely paralyzed on her left side. And this is the scene in which I first see her in rehab. She has just told me that she's renamed her left arm Lazarus, that she's going to bring it back from the dead, and that she's had a talk with God about it. And I have brought some lavender-scented lotion, and you'll hear why. For a long time, I didn't think I had a story to write. But after this event, after this scene, after this moment happened, I knew I had to write this book, and I think you'll understand why. I'm sorry, I've got this rather terribly, I don't know whether I can crook my little finger or not, but I've got this odd water arrangement up here. And maybe I can do this without spilling. When she closed her eyes again, I poured a puddle of lotion onto my palm. In Connecticut, I had decided on touch, not talk. In our family, no one knew the gentle art of honest conversation, of talking over our differences. Instead, we tripped over our words and tumbled into silences that were constricted, not spacious, the wrong sort of tide that binds. Words might be my way of attempting repair and solace, but my sister, I'd finally realized after years of too much mud pie, needed a way to bridge distances that soothed the body first. Boldly, I began the massage on her left side, avoiding the bulk of her body, keeping my focus on her affected leg, hoping that my hands would transfer to her body an acceptance and compassion, a nurture I'd never given her. We'd been sisters for almost 50 years, but I couldn't remember ever touching her body like this. One measure of love is lost. I wondered if Liz loved her body less or more now that she had lost the use of her left arm and leg. As I massaged her leg, wondering what she could feel, I began to hear our mother's voice. The door to our childhood bedroom narrowed open, my mother singing into the dark where Liz and I lay unready for sleep. She was singing the lullaby that ends all through the night. I couldn't remember the rest of the words, but I could still see her about to withdraw, and the stroke of light that crossed the coverlet as her alto patience and intimate refrain lilted over us like a hand stroking back damp hair from a feverish forehead. Who knows if the body believes the words we offer it, or if it listens only to the motive below the motive, octaves down. As my hands touched my sister's immobilized flesh, we were once again side by side in the dark of our old bedroom. Once again, we were children, our small bodies already ripening to the sweet danger within us. Were anyone to ask me now if I believe in resurrection, body and mind, I'd have to hum what little I remember of the song that long ago that carried us all through a night that was deeper than we could know. As I massaged her legs, as my body faintly rocked back and forth to increase the rhythm, all the years I forgot to remember her, all the years I scorned and disregarded part of my own heart fell away. And it came to me in a shudder of surprise that I had all these years loved her without knowing that I loved. What was it in me that had concealed that love so stubbornly? How was it possible to love and not to know? So that's the question. How is it possible to love and not to know? That became the catalytic question, the driving force behind this narrative, and I found myself compelled to remember. Now, writing a memoir is a little bit like walking to Mrs. Bishop's for piano lessons. It was a long way away from the Margaret I was as a child and as a teenager and so forth. So that Margaret, whatever she was, I had to treat as a persona, someone I needed to get back into her skin. But remember, there was the Margaret who kicked stones, and the Margaret who this, and the Margaret who that, the Margaret of each moment by moment, breath by breath. And so really there wasn't a Margaret waiting for me to go and inhabit. I had to start remembering things and writing them down, and gradually, it's not, everyone thinks that in writing a memoir, the self writes the story, but it isn't. The story creates and writes the self from those earlier years, or at least that was my experience of it. Liz also asked a few questions in the weeks that followed. One was, why did Mother love you more than me? Heartbreaker. And another one, not a question, I was trying to leave one time, and I had to go do some stuff to my mother, and Elizabeth was telling me one dumb blonde joke after the other, trying to delay my exit. And finally, when she knew I was leaving, or trying to get out the door, she said, "Don't leave, tell me a story." So this book then, in the second chapter, becomes the story that I tell my sister. And for 5 years, the last 5 years of my sister's life, we became very, very good friends, finally. And some of her memories are in this book. It's my story, but what she could remember and tell me about things helped me to flesh out many of the people and also, of course, herself. Now, something that happened when I was writing this book, Eudora Welty talks about the secret underneath the secret, and the second secret being sometimes more surprising. I don't know whether this was more surprising, but I found as things I remembered came back to me, and I wrote them down, that I was remembering a lot of things about difference, about the wedge of difference. I grew up in the 1950s in Richmond at a time when racial barriers were very firm, when gender barriers were pretty darn firm too, and so were class barriers. If you were different from somebody else, you didn't really have to have a relationship with them. Wendell Berry has a wonderful book called The Wound of Knowledge. Do any of you all know it? Go out and get it. Take it out of the library. It's wonderful. It's about the hidden wound that happens in the dominant class for white people in racial situations. He's not trying to say white people suffered more than black, but there is this hidden wound that we ignore to our peril. What I discovered, and I'm going to read you now, I'm going to turn back to One Body and read you a long poem called Respect. Because even though it's a long poem, it's a narrative poem, and it's a little more concise than reading. You know what? I'm going to read. I'm in Richmond. I'm going to read you some of the Richmond scenes, okay? But what I discovered was that although the climate of racial separation did not, and sense of difference, absoluteness of difference, did not cause my sense of separation or indifference from my sister. I think it sanctioned it. Because the code was that if you were different, you didn't really have to have a relationship with that other different person. And everyone described my sister and me as extremely different. I will read you another scene later on in the book that comes a little closer to that. But right now I'm going to read you an odd scene. This is the first night that I spent the night away from home. I have changed the names to protect some of the innocent. I spent the night with my friend Courtney Harrison. I would be, in 1 year later, a student at St. Catherine's School. My mother was a second grade teacher there, and St. Catherine's is a wonderful school. I got a great education, but I was a little bit of an outsider because it was a rich girls' school and where my family was not wealthy, and I was keenly aware of that. If the writer and the child had known that I was being given the gift of outsider's eye, it might have eased it up, but it was pretty uncomfortable. Okay, so we're going over to spend the night with Courtney Harrison. Mrs. Harrison was a woman who set a great store on appearances. Courtney's clothes were expensive, even though she was starting off in public school. They just moved to Richmond. It would take some time to get her through the waiting list for St. Catherine's, Miss Harrison said. My clothes were secret hand-me-downs which Mom obtained from Mrs. Black, a lady whose daughter Nancy, 1 year older, attended St. Catherine's. I was not to speak of the fact that my favorite red jacket and most of my dresses had been passed to Mom over the front fence by Mrs. Black's maid, who was cleaning out closets every season, looking for whatever had been outgrown or was no longer admired. Mom knew Mrs. Black from the country, and they were both Presbyterians. Mom wore one of Mrs. Black's sweaters, the one with seed pearls, and that was a secret too. When Miss Harrison praised the sweater and asked where on earth Mom found such a treasure, Mom just smiled. When I spent the night at Courtney's house, Mrs. Harrison had the table set with her best china and silver, and she lit candles. She and Mr. Harrison sat at the grown-up ends of the tables, and Courtney and I sat across from each other with flower arrangement blocking our view of each other's faces. Mrs. Harrison reached slowly over her empty plate and rang a silver bell, at which the kitchen door opened, and a short, elderly colored woman brought in the thick broiled steak on a platter. Thank you, Minerva, Mrs. Harrison murmured to the door as it shut behind Minerva. Minerva, I was told, had been with them since Courtney was born. As I would learn later that summer, Courtney bossed Minerva around, and she even slapped her once when a dress had been improperly hung in the closet. I couldn't imagine slapping Marie. Marie is a black woman from Amelia County I knew fairly well as a child. I couldn't imagine wanting to. Neither could I imagine asking Courtney why her mother let her slap any person who was older, no matter what her color. By July, Courtney had earned the title Queen Courtney. Queen Courtney was so completely a queen that she found it beneath her to play queen and court with us in our hideout. Her home is her castle, Mrs. Dorch sneered, and I wondered what Courtney had said to Susan that made Mrs. Dorch so touchy. That's the way it seemed to work. If the children had a tiff, the parents had one too. I watched Mrs. Harrison lift a doll-sized coffee cup to her lips and sip what a doll would sip. I watched Mr. Harrison carve the sirloin faultlessly, giving me too much because I was an honored guest. Me like a grown-up, I thought, and I felt pleased. Then I felt awkward. I really didn't know how to play the part they'd assigned me. Wasn't I really just a child? I was more comfortable being ignored, or nearly so, and I almost envied Minerva. For the Harrisons, Minerva didn't seem to exist as she passed the vegetables to our left, waiting silently as we took what we wanted. It was as if the silver dishes floated around the table on a current of air. In Amelia, Marie put the serving dishes on the table directly, and Aunt T talked to her, and Marie laughed and answered back and teased and rubbed her belly. She told us to save some for her now. Don't eat it all up. Minerva was, by comparison, a silhouette. Do you eat dinner like that every night? I asked Courtney upstairs in the bedroom as we unpacked my new green suitcase. Every night. take how much you want. Mom serves my plate. Courtney said, it's our station in life. That's what Mom says. She bought new dessert dishes just because you'd be coming to dinner and she wanted the cherry sauce to be set off by the blue border. She's just that way. When Courtney came to our house to spend the night, Mom cooked spaghetti and we ate at the kitchen table because that was our way on Saturday night. But she did make a special chocolate cake. We ate early and by ourselves so that there would be light left in the backyard for croquet. I wondered if Courtney would be miffed that Mom fed us in the kitchen. Only Minerva ate in the kitchen in comparison. But Courtney seemed to be relieved, especially after asking Mom to pour her some milk. And Mom said, as polite as you please, it's right there in the refrigerator. I'm stirring the sauce. Would you help yourself, please? In the beginning, Mom and Mrs. Harrison talked on the phone 2 or 3 times a week, but I wondered if they really were friends. They never got dressed up and went anywhere together, except the one time Mom asked for a ride to the Safeway on a Wednesday, Mrs. Harrison's shopping day. Once Mrs. Harrison was at ease with her move to Richmond, she rarely called. Richmond was a hard city to move into, she said. It was like Charleston society. You were either in or out. I'm going to read the moment in which I had a kind of an understanding. And it came, interestingly enough, not through direct contact with people, but through a rather, what I have to tell you is an embarrassing moment to read about. Not only am I in the bathroom in the scene, which is okay, but what really is appalling to me is that this little epiphany comes after I have read a little story in Reader's Digest. Not exactly my notion of what precedes epiphany, but and not high literary art, but that is what I was reading, Reader's Digest. I was taking my time in the bathroom reading, etc. So I'm going to just pick up the scene at this point. I'd taken out the toilet roll and put it back. I'd examined the scar on my knee and a fresher scrape from a spill off my bike. Finally, I turned to the Reader's Digest. I read a few jokes and then began a story in which 2 colored people were taking a train. I hadn't been on a train since I was 9 months old during the war. According to Mom, I'd flirted with the men in uniform as they passed up and down the aisles. At 10, I couldn't imagine flirting with a uniformed man or with any man. Reading slowly along, I came to the moment in the story when the colored man leaned over and kissed his colored woman wife. A tender moment, affectionate, like those teasing moments in the kitchen when my father would put his hand on the back of my mother's thigh as she got the butter from the icebox. The colored man was more careful than my father, perhaps because he was on a train, visible to the public. I stopped reading just as his lips found hers, struck by the warmth of the moment, into which these words formed in my mind. Colored people kiss. I was shocked. If they kissed, they were like us. I stared at the erratic wisps of pimento in a tile. I leaned over and cracked the Venetian blind just enough to see out the slats through the dogwood branches and into Miss Conrad's yard. But I couldn't shake the strange idea. I reread the sentence in which the colored man kissed his wife on a train going north. He had to lean over the picnic basket between them on the seat. I could smell the fried chicken in the hamper, still warm, its oil soaking into the napkins. I could smell Mary's kitchen in Aunt T's house in Amelia, and I could feel Mary's breath hot along my cheek when she said, phew, bending over to flap a hand towel past my ear, flicking a fly off a pan of turnover rolls she just pulled out of the wood stove. I could smell the yeast, the trail of Mary's sweat along her dark arms, the smell of the colored man on the train and his wife's perfume, maybe Evening in Paris from a fancy cobalt blue bottle from the New York courthouse drugstore. I pulled out my cotton underpants and play shorts, torn but good enough for the backyard. I thought, excited, that I should tell my mother. She should know what I just found out. Did anybody in Richmond know this? Colored people kiss. Like us. I stopped short of clicking open the bathroom door. Reader's Digest in hand, my index finger in it to mark the page on which a colored man and his wife and his woman were kissing. But what if she already knew? What if Mom knew and never mind knowing still explained that colored people should sit in the back of the bus because they might have a disease? What if she knew and never mind knowing reminded me that there weren't colored ladies, only colored women? What if she said Unc was right to call Mary's husband Boy when anyone could see he was older than my cousins Johnny and Lee? What if she knew that colored people were like us and the knowledge made no difference? How did I know I was right? I slipped my finger from between the pages and put the Reader's Digest back on the handbook. I knew what I knew, but I couldn't think how to tell anyone. Colored people kiss. Of course they did, even if I'd never seen it. Even if no one spoke of love between them, only of the number of dirty children they had on dirt floors, children who could barely fit into the little houses with the blue ball bushes in front. Those are hydrangeas, I call them. What if colored people kissing proved nothing to anyone but me? There was a rule about keeping colored people separate, so how could my knowing that they were just like us make a difference? I'd only get in trouble. Mom kept secret. For the time being, tucked out of sight in the new bathroom no colored person would ever be allowed to use, I'd have to keep what I knew secret. Colored people. It's an embarrassing scene to read in a way. I hope you hear the voice. There are two voices in memoir. One is the voice of innocence, the child's voice, and that dominates and gets older as the book goes along and prose style goes up a bit. Prose complexity of the sentences goes up a bit. But being different, or was a big thing in Richmond. I'm going to read you just a very short little moment. I'm at Mary Munford School in the 4th grade. And I've just begun to realize that I'm not just a sum of my family parts, whether I look like my father or my mother, or I have this honest trace or whatever. I was making my own way in the world, or people might mistake me for things or whatever. I was getting good grades, and I had that as a kind of a reputation. So I was absolutely stunned to find one day, although I was beginning to realize that I was the sum of whatever others saw or thought they saw when they looked at me. I was stunned when a boy pulled up beside on the bike and said, "Are you Jewish?" An older boy from the 6th grade asked me, leaning on the bike. He had skidded to a halt beside me, his smile masking the accusation or what felt like an accusation. I denied it. "Would you have such thick eyebrows?" he said, and pedaled off, laughing. I did have thick eyebrows. Did Jews have thick eyebrows? In my whole life, I'd only seen one Jewish boy. He was in Courtney's classroom, a boy with blue eyes and brown hair, Peter Solomon, and his eyebrows were thin wisps along the brow bone. The boy on the bike didn't know what he was talking about. "He's just flirting," Susan said. "It's courtship, dummy." "Fine way to flirt," I replied, and made a face I knew Susan would laugh at. I was cheered by her interpretation, but not so cheered that I couldn't see something I didn't like. I was prejudiced against Jews, even though I didn't know any Jews. How had that happened, I marveled. I didn't think I disliked Jews, although I'd heard the word prejudice at church, where some kids said that the Jews killed Jesus, didn't they? But what else could my not wanting to look like a Jew mean? I was stunned that I could be what I hadn't given myself permission to be. It was like being fat without eating. It was like being blindfolded without a physical blindfold or without agreeing to it. I was simply unable to see the darkened way of the world right in front of me. Both of these passages come in a chapter called Fitting In, which I guess I'm not going to read this scene, but the chapter ends with a scene in which Mrs. Harrison shows up in an expensive camel's hair coat from Rinaldo's, and she's picking up Courtney, and they're going to Bullies for tea. but she's giving all of us who walk to Mary Munford a ride home. And I've never heard this rule before, but there were enough of us, so there was Courtney in the front seat, and there were 4 in the back, and then there was my sister waiting to get into the car, and Mrs. Harrison said, "I'm sorry, dear, you won't fit. There's a law that says only 4 in the back seat." Anybody ever heard the 4 in the back seat? Well, I never had either, but anyway, that's what she said. And Mrs. Harrison was very imperious and in a hurry, and I didn't intervene. And my sister walked home bawling. It's one of those family moments that everybody remembers. She walked home bawling. As I looked at her out the window when the car drove off, there was a little flash that escaped my eyes, as I recall it, that meant I fit in and you don't, even though I was embarrassed about it. Mother and Mrs. Harrison didn't speak for a year until they came one day to tea or whatever. But the whole chapter is about various ways of fitting in or not and how to be left out and so on. So that is part of what this book is about. Or I've just read you some of the momentary scenes. There are just a few in here that have to do with recognizing the difference. I'm going to read one more part from here and then close with a couple of poems. When I was 15, my father had a nervous breakdown, and he was taken to Tucker's, and he had shock treatments in various things. And my sister and I were told not to breathe a word of this to anybody at school. And we didn't. It was a very tough time at home, and I'm going to read you the part in which my sister, I'm in my room doing my homework, and my sister passes through the bedroom to get to her bedroom. And she makes an accusation. Look at you. Dad's sick, and what kind of feelings are you showing anyone? You just don't care, do you? I wheeled around in my chair, knocking books off the desk, and told her to keep her mouth shut. What did she know about my feelings? I thrust at her a notebook page on which I'd listed how I could help the family, how I might make a little extra money. There were expenses I was sure I could defray or defer or cancel altogether. Immediately, the list looked puny and pathetic in my eyes, but I forced my voice to be firm and steady. Not everyone shrieks and cries. There are other ways to have feelings, I said, surprised to see a faint look of respect on my sister's face, then a glimmer of satisfaction. Her forehead smoothed out. Okay, then, she concluded, and handed back the list. It wasn't the list, I realized, that had swayed her to acknowledge my way of handling myself as valid. She'd gotten my goat. I'd wheeled around, raised my voice, violence and volume. She understood these displays. As she abandoned the room, I imagined that I could see the shadows of old bruises of Dad's belt on the back of her legs. Bruises she had suffered, bruises she understood. For as long as I could remember, I had tried to avoid my father's angry punishments, but she had baited him and met him in battle. If she couldn't best him or save herself, she would not be cowed, and even now Dad preferred her to me, I thought. He respected her anger and did not like my distance dignity, what he called my plain queen. You're so different, I whispered to my sister's closed door, and it's not my fault. I wasn't ready to say it also wasn't her fault, but I was beginning to question why in our family there was so much blaming of others. No one said, it's my fault. We found someone else to blame, a way to duck it. I remembered how my mother, struck down into the ashes like Job on the day Dad was taken to Tucker's, sobbed about the motive and cue for his distress going back to childhood. Then she swallowed hard and wiped away her tears, saying, at least it's not anything I've done. The doctor assured me of that. That said, she buried her head in her pillow. I had, at that particular particular time of my life been the subject of some gossip at school, and nobody was calling me any anymore. I'm just skipping a paragraph. And I'm feeling particularly alone. And then that thought moves into this one. Dad, I realized suddenly, didn't have any friends either. There were people he talked to at work and at church, but did he have any friends? Ever since we'd been going to St. Catherine's, Mom had learned to shield Dad from casual pleasantries and exchanges with the parents of my friends. You never know what's going to come out of that man's mouth, Mom would say mournfully. She worried about grammar. She worried about pronunciation. She worried about the word ain't. Dad said faux for do for door. He said family, chimbley, pretty. He said by and by, as in we're going to get there by and by. Mom declared that the family cook in Bon Air had taken care of Dad while Nanny flounced off into Richmond to go to the women's club, taking the train in the morning and staying away all day. Dad talked the way he did, she said, because of the colored cook. And the cook, as I had only recently learned, probably spoke as she did because such expressions and pronunciations were common in early slave-owning Virginia. Distressed cavaliers and indentured servants from southwestern England, from Wessex and Sussex, used the words Dad's family cook had used in Bon Air. A Sussex accent in England, extinct by 1860, flourished among poor whites and blacks of the American South. I bring you deep. Mom made it sound as if Dad grew up next to the family wood stove with the colored people, or back of the woodshed getting whipped. How did Dad feel about himself? He couldn't be a white man in West End Richmond and talk like a colored man and not have somebody look at you and know something was wrong. Would I become lonely like Dad? He had no friends to talk to, and now I had no one to talk to but myself. Younger, I'd been given a diary with a lock on it, and I'd written in it until its pages were full, often writing about my sister and our daily Cold War. Assigned a character sketch in English class recently, I'd written about my sister, stunned to realize as I wrote it how little I knew her. To cover my embarrassment and wanting a good grade, worried that I might have to read the sketch aloud in class, I'd invented details, making Elizabeth a stereotyped younger sister who borrowed my clothes and copied me. Cleverly written, it fooled everyone but my sister. After reading it, Elizabeth was offended. You don't care enough to know who I am, she charged. I wondered if now, having felt what it was like to be shut out, I could write in the privacy of a journal and be more honest. Writing in solitude, I might break through the silences that had gathered in my heart. A short story had been assigned in English class, and we'd been advised to draw on our experiences, using our imagination to deepen the innocent experience into higher knowledge. Were I to disguise our family and write about a lonely man gone mad and taken from his family, the story might have readers who would see through my inventions and find at the core of the story my broken father, my sorrowful mother, my rude sister, and a scornful someone so like me that gossip and rumor would flare. I couldn't write anything about my family and show it to others. And yet write I must, I decided. Write I would. Not for other readers, but words for my eyes only. I pulled from my desk a spiral notebook I'd been saving for Latin composition. Instead of a dead language, I'd write words that would fall like seeds into a secret garden. A puff of wind and the lock and key to that garden would show itself underneath the long tendrils of ivy. Inside that secret garden, the door carefully closed behind me. I'd be where I could say anything. I could whisper whatever I was afraid to say. I could hear only myself speaking what only I knew. And if I didn't know, if I couldn't speak, I would be alone in a place of solace and possible burgeoning of turned earth and gentle rain. No one would be looking at me. I wouldn't have to be what anyone else wanted me to be. I could say and see what I could see and say what I saw. And if it turned out I was living in a world too mysterious to understand, or if it happened that I was hopelessly ignorant or blind, then I could pray. I could pray and in that solitude rectify the heart, as the new minister at St. Giles liked to say. I thought it a pompous phrase. Now the words seemed right. Writing in the spiral notebook, I promised myself the discipline and joy of writing each day. Before I began my homework, if not then, before going to bed, cross my heart and hope to die, I whispered to myself, feeling again like a child and liking the feeling. I would start by writing about breakfast with my family around the small kitchen table, when Elizabeth and I played forts and moats with our eggs and toast, or when Dad took us to the basement, his eyes flashing fire. Well, I'm running out of time. I find it impossible to plan a prose reading. It's just too much. I'm going to read you one very short poem to sort of resolve where we started, or resolve things. And the poem is from one body. It's called Cooking Supper While My Sister Dies. My sister had so many things wrong with her, and she was so miserable that her death was a kind of blessing. But saying that, you can't say that either, and it was hard. It was also very mercifully swift. It was so swift that I couldn't get down there, although she was in the hospital for some hours. And her husband called me and held the phone up to my sister's ears. And she said, "Hello, Margaret." Of course she said that, but those were the last words she ever said to me. And in terms of, the other book is called The Prodigal Daughter. And if the last words my sister spoke to me were, "Hello, Margaret," it was a welcoming home. It's a homecoming. I finally realized that at a certain point. Later that night, there were some people coming to dinner, and I was cooking supper, knowing that my sister was dying. She takes her last meal of sugar water and oblivion, the needle keen as a knife, a double-edged bridge she must cross into the unsayable. Wait, I say, wait. But she will not, nor can I go with her. Delay in each grain of rice, exile in the onions I chopped so fine I am word blind, my face wet with the rain that was her grief and mine, that we did not love each other long enough. Black olives, then zucchini diced, swept into a pan from the wooden board, a heave offering to the wine-dark sea. One body. I am born in a field of cornflowers and ripe wheat, wind in the black gum trees late afternoon before the storm, and the men are cutting the field, working the mower in circles, coming in and in toward the center of the field, where I crouch down with the rabbits, with the quail, driven into this space by the clackety mower because I want to see how the body goes still, how the mind, how the lens of the eye magnifies to an emptiness so deep, so flared wide, there is everywhere field, and the source of field, and only a quiver of the nose or the flick of a top-knot feather, a ripple so faint I may have imagined it says yes, says no to the nearing what rustled in the last stand of wheat. Now it's quiet, too quiet, a soft trample, a click, the cocking sound, a swish as the men steal in to take what they want. They are clever, they are hungry, and because this one body is my birthplace, my birthright, my only home place, my nest and burrow and bower, I understand. My mother is wheat, my father is wind, and I rise in a tall gust of rage and compassion. I rise up from the moan and edible debris of the world, wrapped in a bright net of pollen and stars, my thighs twin towers of lightning, and my voice. I am a storm of voices, snipe and wolf, snow goose, dolphin, quail, and lark. Stop this. Stop it now, I say to the men who stalk closer, keen on the kill, laid light on the steel of their rifles. And they are my brothers. They are my brothers, and I love them too.
Look into my eyes, I tell him. See for yourself the one shining field. Look into my